Thank you, Grishma. Next up, we have Dr. Stephen Migalski. Dr. Migalski is a member of both the American Psychological Association and the Illinois Psychological Association. He is an esteemed professor, social scientist, and political activist combating racism and homophobia. His research interests include community-based screening for depression and other mood disorders, relational trauma, and bullying in the LGBT community. Welcome, Dr. Migalski.
Good afternoon. Allow me once again to welcome you here to Adler. Very happy to have you all here. I am a clinical psychologist and an associate professor of psychology here at the university. I also run a private practice on the city's north side in which I serve the LGBT community in the Andersonville neighborhood. I'm the grandson of European immigrants, and I grew up in a working class, multi-generational home where Polish and Italian were both spoken. I'm the son of a grocer and a homemaker, and sadly recently lost both of my parents to illness. I am a devoted husband, brother, uncle, nephew. I'm also a disabled man. I have had Tourette's syndrome since I was a child, and I'm also a gay man. I came out 20 years ago, unabashedly proud to be out of the closet for more than half of my life now. I just turned 50 in August. I came of age in an insular community on the outskirts of Chicago at a time when we gay people were mainly clustered in small pockets of urban centers. And it was a time when transgender people were even more sequestered. Growing up in the city, but just a stone's throw really from the suburbs, I felt utterly invisible as a gay kid. The thing about this kind of invisibility is that it's pernicious, it's destructive. Really not regularly seeing reflections of yourself is emotionally painful and developmentally foreclosing. In the 1980s, we gay and lesbian people were all but absent in Middle America. We were often shunned from our families and virtually non-existent in the mainstream media. Back then, we gay kids did not routinely see images of ourselves on TV, in the movies, and when we did, it was almost always a minor character, nearly always in a negative light, and that character was usually depicted in a violent or criminal context, and usually along with nasty words like faggot or dyke. It was a scary time to be grappling with one's gayness, for sure. In the 1980s, as we were trying to find support from others like ourselves, HIV and AIDS surfaced, and it was enough to scare us deeply back into the closet. And that's exactly what happened to me. I was attending an all-boys Catholic high school where my classmates seemed to perceive me as gay long before I was prepared to see myself as gay. We were bullied often in plain sight of teachers, Catholic school. And teachers would snicker or just turn a blind eye. Frankly, some of those teachers were complicit. They did absolutely nothing when they could have intervened and chose not to. I told myself things would be very different at university. I attended Loyola here in Chicago, and I did meet other gay people, but it was still the mid-'80s, and everything about sexuality was very much on the hush. These years were a time of flirting with self-acceptance, but I'd not yet publicly acknowledged being gay, and sadly it was a time of loneliness, of squelching intimacy needs, and sublimating my hopes and dreams primarily into academic pursuits. For Christ's sakes, I'm a professor. I was going to become a psychologist, study how children became depressed and what supported their healthy development. And I was fairly curious about how gender and sexuality might have been implicated. But as a closeted undergraduate at Loyola, I dared not tell a soul, and my research interest never, at that point, really moved beyond my personal reading. Eventually, I did enroll in Auburn University's doctoral program, several hundred miles south of Chicago in Alabama, far enough from family to give me the comfort to come out delicately. But in retrospect, moving to the Deep South to come out of the closet was not a great idea. I became embroiled in gay politics at a time and in a place that made it very dangerous. We feared reprisal, and reprisal is exactly what we experienced. At Auburn, bullying was far more insidious than anything I'd experienced previously. There was consistent public ridicule, physical violence, and a campus shooting incident that luckily left no one injured, at least not physically so. It's very painful even now to think about being shot at for simply hanging and posting flyers to announce the meetings of a gay student organization. This was 1992. It's unthinkable, really, when I try to wrap my brain around it. These experiences affected my health physically and emotionally, as onerous stress usually does. The shooting was covered by CNN, and as president of the LGBT student organization, I was interviewed, ignoring the fact that I had not yet come out to my family. But my family saw the CNN story. My brothers and sisters tell the story of having seen it a Sunday afternoon as my mother and father prepared dinner. And my mother and father claimed to have not seen it, even though the entire family watched it. Back in Alabama, I felt my secret was out and I was petrified. And in a moment, I was unsure what the future held. I may very well be the only person to have ever come out to his family via CNN interview. Luckily, though, my family was loving and very supportive. My mother and father, my aunts, my uncles, everybody was just lovely. Back to Auburn, I can tell you that one of my Auburn advisors at one point dared ask me if I was sure that child psychology should be the focus of my doctorate. It seemed to come out of nowhere. He looked at me and said in a dissertation meeting, "Perhaps adults should be the focus of your doctorate, Steve. You know, people like yourself." I understood exactly what he was saying. But with resolve, I responded that I was actually quite intent on keeping my original focus of working with and specializing in working with children and families. He looked frustrated and looked at me and said, "Listen, Steve, I'm going to give it to you straight." In my head, I was thinking, no pun intended. People are just not going to take their kids to see an openly gay psychologist. I was crestfallen. And I wondered if my identity as a gay man would keep me from my professional aspirations. The rest of my time in Auburn was emotionally raw, but it was growth enhancing. I started to date, and I was living more fully than before, openly and unapologetically. I developed friendships with other gay people, some having been lifelong, some having become lifelong, I should say. I also developed close attachments with transgender people for the first time in my life. My trans friends modeled an authenticity I had not yet known, a genuineness really of spirit and presence that I found utterly alluring. They taught me to question the uniformity of voices, the uniformity of narratives within the LGBT community, and I opened my heart and my mind to the many unique narratives that actually comprise our community. My trans brothers and sisters really taught me the value of living fully in every moment. They taught me to own my trauma history and helped me to understand that owning my trauma history could help me to be able to eventually create empathy for the people with whom I would work. And these are lessons that I very much carry with me today. While in grad school in Alabama in the 90s, I found myself staunchly entrenched in the life of an activist, and it was not something that I set out to do. Becoming an activist was nothing more than a form of survival, really, for me. You see, when the well-being and the safety of your day-to-day existence and that of your friends is hanging in the balance, you either make some noise, mobilize your resources, fight the injustice that's hurting you and hurting the people that you love and respect, or you simply turn a blind eye and give up. I learned quickly that I'm not very good at turning a blind eye, and I'm even worse at giving up. So for many years, I was doing double duty as both a doctoral student and an activist. Honestly, standing here, it's difficult for me to express to you what coming out as a gay man in Alabama during the 90s was really like. I'd like to ask you, if you can, to imagine living in a state at a time where the law made your expression of sexual and romantic intimacy illegal. That's right, illegal. Prior to 2003, more than half of the states in America made consensual sexual intimacy between members of the same sex illegal, punishable by imprisonment. We're talking, my friends, about America. Imagine also, if you can, living in a small university town where death threats targeted against LGBT people were commonplace, where local police refused to respond to legitimate complaints of gay people who were being intimidated and threatened by vicious, hateful bigots. Now I want you to imagine trying to withstand all of this daily hate while taking classes full-time, seeing patients as part of my clinical rotation, teaching undergraduate classes, and working on my doctoral dissertation research. That was my life for many years. In my eyes, I became an activist to survive, and because it allowed me to channel my anger in the direction of something positive. As such, I attended protest after protest at dozens of Cracker Barrel restaurants, which summarily fired LGBT people simply because of their sexuality. I fought for the rights of LGBT people to congregate publicly on the campuses of state universities, which had been illegal up until the late 1990s. I battled the courts which prohibited us LGBT students from participating in an Adopt a Mile highway program designed to keep a stretch of the freeway clean simply because they didn't want the words gay and lesbian on their highway marker. During all of these experiences came a vicious assault in a movie theater. I can still remember it was a double feature. The Bodyguard with Whitney Houston and Home Alone 2. Tells you a little bit about my age. I was in my early 20s. I'd come out of the theater restroom and was beaten by people who had known me from campus as that queer guy who was the president of the gay group. That incident landed me in the ER. I never told my family about that. Here I was, an activist in an ER, and I wasn't exactly sure how I arrived at that destination. It felt far less like a choice and more like a survival tactic. As I gathered my thoughts and planned to talk to you today, I must admit that reminiscing a lot about my formative experiences was fairly painful. But I also found my thoughts and feelings drawn quite poignantly to this past summer, to the events that took place in Charlottesville, when hundreds of nationalist extremists and white supremacists descended upon the university town for a rally over the removal of a Confederate statue that was a painful reminder of a time when people of color in America were slaves. As you know, violence broke out and life was lost, and the current occupant of the White House poured fuel on the fire with hateful rhetoric, turning Charlottesville into a powder keg. The following day, my husband and I were compelled to hit the streets of Chicago to show our outrage about what had transpired in Virginia, to communicate our disapproval for the vile position that Donald Trump had taken, to show our solidarity with our black and brown brothers and sisters. On that day, when we arrived back home after the Chicago rally to support Charlottesville, I found myself thinking about an event that I hadn't thought about in close to 25 years. Let me be utterly transparent with you. Charlottesville was a very dark week in American history, and it will always be remembered as such, with the senseless loss of life and bright light being shone down upon the pervasive racism of our country. All of this triggered for me a memory of an event some 25 years earlier that I had buried. In the summer of 1992, while a graduate student at Auburn and president of the Gay Student Organization, I worked tirelessly along with my friends in the Black Student Union, not a phrase we would use for an African-American student organization today, but it was known as the BSU. We worked together to end a hateful and racist 77-year-old tradition, something called the Old South Parade, which celebrated pre-Civil War America, a time in which people of color were slaves. You see, at the time, the Kappa Alpha fraternity members and their sister sororities would dress up in antebellum gowns and Confederate Army uniforms, hiring little African-American kids from the neighboring town of Tuskegee to dress up as slave children in the parade. It was a disgusting, vile, hateful mess, something I could not believe I was witnessing even then in 1992. We immediately mobilized our resources, approximately 100 of us from the LGBT student group, students of color from the Black Student Union, literally locked arms, sat in the streets at the corner of College and Magnolia in downtown Auburn, Alabama, and refused to let the Old South Parade pass. We were called faggots and dykes, and the N-word was uttered profusely. That day was really woeful, wretched, really. Yet despite how much hate was spewed on that day back in 1992, much like what transpired in Charlottesville in August, that day in Auburn in the early 1990s became a pivotal and historic day. Our audacity on that day and the solidarity between the gay and lesbian students and the African American students changed history in Auburn, Alabama forever. The Old South Parade was canceled and obliterated, never to be held again. Many of us were arrested on that day. Many of us were bullied, spit upon, beaten in the parade's aftermath. But the Old South Parade is gone. It's gone forever, and it will never return to Auburn. I'm going to end by asking you this. I'm going to ask you to think about what an activist is. Social and political action, engaging with one's community activism, if you prefer, really does change people's minds. It changes how people think, how they feel, and what they do. It has the potential to influence favorably, and when motivated by justice, love, and equity, it can really make the world a better place. I hope you will think about yourself as activists, as people who have the power to change your communities for the better. Ultimately, despite the mentor back in Auburn, I did become a child psychologist, despite his concerns that parents would never take their children to see an openly gay psychologist. Today, I look back with few regrets. I'm privileged to work with children and families at Andersonville Behavioral Health, my private practice, to serve the LGBT community and to teach the next generation of psychologists right here at Adler University, where I have been for nearly 14 years. I'm grateful that advisors who were uncomfortable then with the idea that an openly gay man could be a child psychologist did not dissuade me. I didn't give up hope. I believed the world could change, and it has for me, especially since marriage equality has become the law of the land. I married my husband almost 3 years ago. Things are not as positive, however, for our trans brothers and sisters, for our immigrant brothers and sisters, for our black and brown brothers and sisters, for our Muslim brothers and sisters, all of whom need our commitment, our respect, and our advocacy if we're to establish an equitable culture that facilitates the well-being of all people. We have a long way to go to achieve equity and fairness for all people, and to more firmly establish the strides made by us gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. We have come a long way since I began my graduate studies at Auburn 25 years ago. My ability to speak to you this openly and this honestly today, and this program itself, are evidence of that fact. Please, I implore you, let's work to make America move forward, not backward. Thank you, and I wish you peace.